everyone. My name is Halima Siddiqui, and I'm a project coordinator at Health Nexus. So Health Nexus oversees several provincial initiatives related to FASD. The FASD provincial website, where you can find recent and up-to-date information about what's happening, learn more about resources and tools, and find out services available in your local community. We also allocate subsidies every year to 40+ support groups for individuals with FASD and their families. And we designed an online training for service providers from various sectors, including healthcare and nursing, education, mental health and addictions, justice and corrections, and community and social work. Before we start the presentation, we would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let's take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Today, for our speakers, we are welcoming Dr. Katy Flannigan, who is a psychologist and researcher whose work is focused on the clinical implications of neurodevelopmental diversity. She has special interest in FASD and factors that influence day-to-day functioning, well-being, and outcomes for individuals and their families. Catherine has been involved in the FASD field since 2006 as both a researcher and service provider with children, adults, and families affected by the disability. Next, we also have Dorothy Reid, who is a mother, grandmother, and passionate advocate shaped by lived experience with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. She and her husband raised 2 sons and co-parented 3 grandchildren, all prenatally exposed to alcohol. With over 30 years in adult forensic settings across Canada, Dorothy recognized how cognitive impairments, often undiagnosed, limited clients' ability to benefit from treatment. After her sons were diagnosed with FASD, she championed awareness and identification within the correctional system, leading to the development of specialized programs for individuals with brain injuries and possible FASD. Upon retiring from Correctional Service of Canada, she joined the Canada FASD Research Network's Family Advisory Committee, where she spent the past decade ensuring caregiver perspectives shape research and knowledge sharing. Dorothy continues to be a strong voice for families and has been deeply involved in the care study since its inception. Dr. Melissa Dobson is an instructor in the Bachelor of Technology Management program at NAIT. She holds a PhD in biochemistry and has contributed to the discovery of 3 human genes and a new bacterium through her work in academia and industry. While working in laboratories and years of infertility, she and her husband adopted 3 wonderful humans. They are all affected by prenatal alcohol exposure and have grown from bouncing babies to turbulent, wonderful teens. Passionate about advocacy and community support, Melissa hopes to bring this passion to supporting those living with FASD. Outside of work, she values time with her family and dreams of quiet walks, mindfulness, breathwork, and reading. We're thrilled to listen to the presentation. Please ask your questions in the Q&A, and I'll provide more information and links in the chat if need be. With that, I'm going to pass it on to the speakers.
Katie's just bringing up our slide deck now, but I just want to say that we're very grateful to be able to be here today and to speak to you. And please, we want this to be as informative and informal as possible for a webinar that's on Zoom. So please feel free to enter comments in the chat box and into the question and answer section, and we'll do our best to try and answer them. Halima did a great land acknowledgement, but I'd just like to acknowledge that as a research team, we come from a variety of different traditional lands. And I would like to express how grateful I am to live in the traditional land of the Stolo people, the people of the river. They've been caregivers of this land since time immemorial, and I am committed to do my best to try and uphold the sacred trust that they have provided in us and allowing us to live in these lands. I just want to give you a brief orientation to us. Halima again did a great introduction, and the 3 of us are speaking to you today, but we're not the only people that have been involved in this research. So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Jacqueline Pye and Audrey McFarland and Dr. Mansfield Mila, who are part of the research team. But I'd particularly like to acknowledge and thank the hundreds of caregivers that have taken time out of their very busy lives to spend a couple of hours answering a bunch of questions on an online survey. So our gratitude goes to all those caregivers who have participated in this study.
Thank you, Dorothy. Personally, I'm honored to raise 3 descendants of Canada's first people and also acknowledge that they come from treaties 10 and 2. And I'm so very humbled to have them call me mom and try to do my best to parent and reflect and seek out education to ensure that they know and appreciate their nations and appreciate a better future through truth and reconciliation. My children were all adopted through birth or at birth, sorry, and are impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure in various ways. And they're all amazing. They're currently 15, 16, and almost 18. And I'm super humbled and excited to be part of this study. As we go through the study, we have a rough outline of what we're going to talk about and what we're going to present. So we're going to go and present what we're doing, what we've learned, where we're going, and we invite you to ask questions again through the Q&A section.
We're also going to talk a little bit about the history of the Family Advisory Committee and the CARE project specifically, and give some context from the literature around the experience of caregivers with people with FASD. First of all, the Family Advisory Committee was developed by CanFASD to really bring the voice of living experience caregivers into the research. One of the things that CanFASD feels very strongly is that without having the voice of people with living experience, the research is not going to be as practical and as comprehensive and as sensitive to the needs as it is if we have that voice at the table. So collaboration was very important for us from the very beginning. So the Family Advisory Committee has 2 main functions. One is to provide input from a caregiver perspective on research that's being done by CanFASD and to help to set the priorities for future research. The other is to assist with knowledge translation because there's a lot of information that we've gained from research, but it often sits in a journal somewhere up on an office somewhere and doesn't really get translated to a way that is useful for people with living experience, service providers, policymakers. So that was part of our priority too, is to help with the knowledge translation. So one of the first things we did is, because we didn't feel that the 8 of us could really truly represent the experience of caregivers, we had a workshop called FASD Research Learning Together. And in that workshop, we invited a number of caregivers, people with lived experience, adults with FASD, service providers, policymakers that wanted to attend, and the FASD researchers from CanFASD. And we kind of flipped the table on the researchers and said, this time you just get to sit and listen. And so we had a number of discussions around topics that were really pertinent to caregivers to provide some information to the researchers about what our priorities were. And from that, a number of objectives were developed for CanFASD and specifically for CanFASD researchers. And it led to some of the things like towards healthy outcomes, because we're talking about how, the research projects tend to focus on little things, like math skills or something like that. And it can often take a couple of years for a research project to get completed and then published. And a couple of years is usually short. But could we have something that gives the general principles of how to modify your programs so that we can have better outcomes for people with FASD? And Dr. Jacqueline Pye took that task on and developed towards healthy outcomes. And if you haven't taken a look at that work, I would strongly recommend it. So that's an example of trying to create the resources that the community can use. From now, I'm just going to give it on to Katie to talk a little bit about the research context that this project came from.
Thanks, Dorothy. I always appreciate that kind of context setting and the history piece, because I think it demonstrates the priority and the importance that we acknowledge around the living experiences and the voices of caregivers and people with FASD, and how it really guides our work. So as a researcher, I don't get to spend much time um, in real conversations with people about FASD or how their experiences with FASD are. And so having that event, which was actually one of my first CanFASD events, learning together, was nearly 10 years ago. It was such an impactful and career kind of shaping event where I got to hear stories and really make meaning of things that caregivers and families were sharing. So zooming out, that said, zooming out a little bit to the academic literature, we know from the research that's been done in populations with disabilities, not just FASD, but other disabilities and other illnesses or needs, that being a caregiver is really hard. And it is associated with lots of different impacts on how our well-being, our coping, our health, both physical and mental. And when you add layers of complexity to the needs of people you're caring for, that adds extra layers of impact. So there's with families of people with other disabilities, again, not just FASD, there are certain things that are identified in the literature as being linked to these caregiver stressors or caregiver challenges. That said, there's not a lot. It's growing now in the last couple of years, the literature on caregivers of folks with FASD, but it's relatively limited. So what we do know about the experiences of caregivers of those with FASD are that there are elevated levels of stress. Caregivers and families are reporting high levels of stress. Almost all of caregivers who have participated in a couple of recent studies reported clinically elevated levels of stress, meaning that many would use this threshold as saying, okay, you are so stressed out that you could really benefit from some sort of therapeutic intervention. And of course, not surprisingly, the majority of caregivers also want more support. One interesting thing that I like to point out when looking at this kind of contextual research is that a few studies have shown that caregivers of people with FASD face different and higher levels of stress than caregivers of children with other disabilities. So it's very limited and preliminary, but it's just an interesting thing to share with folks to kind of suggest or demonstrate that this is a really unique experience that can benefit from some kind of targeted focus and intervention.
I think that for me, it's good to see that literature so I don't feel like I'm the only one that's going crazy. But one of the problems with that is that a lot of the research that had been done on caregiver experience was on caregiver stress, caregiver burnout. There wasn't anything that we could find that really looked at the whole story, looked at a balanced picture, because it's good to know that other caregivers are really stressed out, but how does that help me in terms of functioning? How does that instill any kind of sense of hope in me? And trying to think about that from the perspective of an individual with FASD, that sure puts a lot of load of blame on them for being the way they are. So one of the things that we really wanted to do was to look more at what caregivers gain from that experience. What has increased their resilience? What can increase their resilience? And how we can support them more so that everyone can actually have a better experience in living with FASD.
And so the question then remains that how do we best look at supporting caregivers? we don't have the answers, but there is some helpful research that's come out over the last couple of years that focuses on opportunities for potential areas of improvement. One study cited here focused on self-care among caregivers, and it was found that a person's confidence in their self-care was related to lower levels of distress, increased parent satisfaction, and increased satisfaction in family needs getting met. So the frequency of self-care was also related to this confidence. The authors also identified important barriers to support caregivers, including time restraints, lack of resources, family needs and challenges, exhaustion, health issues, mood, logistics, and pride. All of these findings are really important to help identify opportunities for developing and implementing policies and support that allow parents to overcome challenges and engage in more regular self-care. And I know as a caregiver, self-care is kind of sometimes the last thing on my mind. So it's great to see literature that supports uh, the feelings you have when you're in the role. And then in terms of another recent study, researchers measured self-compassion in caregivers of individuals with FASD and found that higher levels of self-care were also significantly correlated with higher levels of pride, lower levels of distress, shame, and guilt. Again, these studies offer a nice starting point for guiding our work towards better understanding of how to support caregivers and their families. So I would like to frame this work with some words from a caregiver from the CARE study. They write, you're going on an extraordinary journey. Make sure you keep yourself healthy, learn as much as you can, find others in the same position, stand up for yourself, and learn to advocate. Remember to breathe. So in this mindset, we're going to include some breathing breaks as we present the information. So this is one of the many self-care activities from the CARE study. While asking survey questions take time to go through the whole survey as a caregiver and may build or trigger some anxiety or agitation. So it's really nice to have grounding exercises such as these integrated within the survey itself. And it's nice to remind ourselves that we have permission to take time to reflect. And so we're going to go through one grounding exercise that's comes straight out of the CARE study. So I want you to sit comfortably, everybody in the audience. I can't see you, but I'm hoping you are. Put your feet firmly on the ground, close your eyes, and take 3 deep breaths. So in through the nose and out through the mouth. In through the nose and out through the mouth. Then I want you to open your eyes and look around the room. I want you to identify 5 things you can see. And when you're done that, I'd like you to identify 4 things that you could feel that all have different textures. Then think about 3 things that you can hear. So listen to the sound within your room that you're in, the sound outside the room you're in, and the sounds going on around you. I want you to look at 2 things you can smell. And imagine those or smell those through your nose. And finally, I want you to think about 1 thing you can taste. And it can just be the taste in your mouth that is happening right now. It could be something that you had for breakfast or lunch. And then take 1 more deep breath. I hope you all feel a little more grounded as we go further in. So here's another example of an intentional, rigorous, and theoretically rooted study. This study examined the strengths and influences of children with FASD. It included 30 caregivers with kids average age of 6.5 years. It highlighted 4 main areas. Under tangible contributions, there were tangible contributions to the family. They included chores and helping out with household tasks. Under parental and personal growth, there were new experiences that helped the caregiver grow as a person, increase their parenting skills, and inspired to teach and let them learn to think outside the box. In terms of social and family togetherness, there was a sense of belonging and completeness brought about by the addition of the child to the family. In terms of emotional contribution, there was affirmations of love or showing affection towards the family by bringing joy or happiness into the home by the children. The paper also highlighted adaptive strengths, such as a child being able to emotionally regulate themselves, figuring out how to deal with problematic behavior, parental stress management skills, and parental satisfaction. And some of the best research is inspired by living experience. And so Katie has co-created taking quotes from the wisdom of participants in the care study to create a lived experience book that we'll talk about later.
So, and now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the CARE study. CARE stands for Caregiver Approaches, Resilience, and Experience in Raising Individuals with FASD. And I think the research that Melissa was just talking about was really helpful in terms of giving much more of a balanced perspective, giving much more a sense of hope, much more of a sense of optimism, and stops us from seeing caregivers as damaged property. I think too long with FASD, there's been such a stigma around individuals with FASD and caregivers and sort of seeing them as damaged, something that needs to be fixed. And I think some of the more recent research and some of the things that we're developing in the CARE study, our hope is that we can start to switch that perspective by capturing the many aspects of the caregiver's context. Their concerns, yes, their family functioning, yes, and their needs for supporting the individual, that's important. But to really formally document the shared experience that we have in being part of a caregiver community, which includes the development of resilience, the strength that we develop, the advocating skills that we develop, that kind of thing. So we can start to see ourselves, and others can start to see us as whole people with challenges, yes, but with strengths as well. We wanted to collect data in a way that really gives voice to the breadth and depth of the caregiver experience, and to substantiate our research questions. Quite often, the Family Advisory Committee was going to the researchers and saying, tell us everything you know about this. For example, tell us everything you know about the effectiveness of alternative therapies with people with FASD. And the researchers would come back and say, well, there really hasn't been any research done in that area. So can't really tell you from an empirical perspective. Or what is the experience of people with FASD in using cannabis, for example? We know anecdotally that some people say that it's helpful and a kind of helpful way of self-medicating for some individuals with FASD. There also are individuals with FASD that develop almost psychotic symptoms because of cannabis use. So tell us everything you know about that. And the researchers would come back and say, well, there's really not that much research done in that area. So part of the goal of the CARE study is to ask about a variety of different areas to support submissions for building grants and for future studies, and to help us tailor those supports and services. And of course, we want to develop resources and knowledge translation pieces for caregivers. And that's where the section on words of wisdom comes from. Really taking that caregiver experience, what they've learned from their experience that works with their child or their adult, and share that with everyone. From that, we provide biannual updates on service providers, on survey findings, I mean, and biannual newsletters to summarize some of the emerging caregiver research. So the CARE study itself is It's big. I gotta say, it's big. It's a very comprehensive survey. It has 3 parts. The first part is on you and your family. Second part is on the perspectives of FASD. And then there's the section on words of wisdom, as I mentioned. And as Melissa mentioned, we knew it was a big ask. For me, I completed the survey. It took me a couple hours to do it. There were parts in it that were pretty triggering. I've got to say that my experience in raising 2 boys with FASD and co-parenting my 3 grandchildren has not always been a bed of roses. And so there have been times when it's been very, very difficult, and I've been very afraid for them. And so when they ask about different questions like substance abuse and involvement with the justice system, it does trigger emotions for me because of my experience in that area. So we wanted to make sure that we were paying back to a certain extent. So that was the reason that we included self-care activities throughout. You can do the survey in chunks. You don't have to do it all at once. You can do it in chunks at the speed that you want to do it. You can take time out, but we wanted to integrate those self-care activities throughout the survey to give something back to the people that are taking the time out of their very, very busy lives to complete the survey. Want to put a little plug in here? Yeah, see, there's a QR code there. That means we're still recruiting for the survey. The survey is going to be open, well, for as long as we know. So we're still trying to collect more data, and we will be talking about the next iteration of the survey a little bit later on. So if you haven't completed the survey, this is a really good chance for you to take down that code and do it. So as I said, one of the things that we wanted to do is give back. And I mentioned that we do regular updates. And if you want to go to the CanFASD website, you can go through some of the updates that we've done in the past. I know from my experience in, the, 40 years since we first adopted our kids. I've been involved in a number of different research projects, and in some cases, it's been really frustrating because I've been asked to tell my story over and over and again, asked the same questions, and in many cases, never heard anything back. Never really got any information about how that information was used, if the information was used. I don't get a bunch of scientific journals delivered to my mailbox, so I never heard anything more about it. So we wanted to make sure in this case, we were providing things back. So anybody that's completed the survey, or in fact, anybody that's even started the survey, if they give us their permission, it goes on a mailing list where we can give biannual updates. And on those updates, we take a certain section of the data, and this add in some of the new studies or caregiver resources and make that available to anybody that's completed the study. It's also, if you haven't completed the study, you can find it on the CanFASD website. We think that's a really important way to take that to make this study a really living, breathing thing. So there's something to be gained for the people that complete it and for everyone else. Melissa also mentioned that we collect words of wisdom, and the words of wisdom is the final section. And what we're in the process of doing now is developing a book that will outline the words of wisdom from caregivers, and want to make that easily available for people with FASD, people that are interested in FASD, caregivers, service providers, because I think, again, another main focus of the study was really to give voice to caregivers. And this is one of the ways of giving voice. It also is a way of providing experiential knowledge and conveying that experiential knowledge, because we know that if you've met one person with FASD, you've met one person with FASD. One of the characteristics of FASD is that everyone with FASD is very unique. They have their own unique strengths, they have their own unique challenges. But we also know that some of the experiences are very similar between people. So if we can gain from other caregivers' experience and what they've learned, even if it doesn't work with our child, it's worth giving it a try if it can help. So by sharing the words of wisdom, we really want to enhance that sense of community that caregivers need to feel like they're not alone in this journey. So I'm going to pass it on now to Katie to talk about what we found out so far.
Thanks, Dorothy. So in terms of kind of the nuts and bolts of the survey, Dorothy mentioned already, it's very comprehensive, it's very long. It was meant to be that way, which is why we made it in sections so that folks could come and go as they needed. But we really wanted to get that broad sense of the caregiving experience in a lot of different areas. So the first bit of the survey is about just basically demographics. So how old caregivers are, what type of caregiver relationship do they have with their children, kind of the standard demographic characteristics that you would collect in any kind of study. We also go into family structure, so composition, so whether a person is a single parent or a grandparent or has one child or has 11 children, all the way through the range of different diverse types of family structures and compositions that you might see for families with those with FASD. And the next big section is around caregiver well-being and coping. We ask a lot about stress levels, emotional well-being, physical well-being, and experiences about how the individuals are coping, the caregivers are coping. And then there's another section around family stability and cohesion. So kind of the way that the family moves through the world, or events or big changes or losses that families go through, as well as the successes and the strengths and strategies and resilience and resources that come from being a family of someone with FASD. So that's sort of the content. We're going to touch very briefly on a couple of these points. As I mentioned, it's really long, so we can't go into every detail, but some of just to give you a sense of what we're learning so far. So far, we have over 220 respondents, and this is starred because over 220 folks started the survey, but have not finished the survey. So we have just over probably around 110 people who have finished the survey in full. The age of caregivers who have participated range from 25 to 80, but on average, caregivers are around 56 years old. The vast majority of respondents to the survey are women, identify as women, and about 2/3 come from Canada. So it's an online survey, and we have sent it out globally, so anybody from anywhere with an internet connection can complete the survey, but about 2/3 are from Canada. We have a large proportion from the States, but then we also have some perspectives from Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Central America. So it's really cool to be able to see, as Dorothy said, how experiences differ from place to place or from family to family, but also those common threads or stories that you hear across all families. In terms of the family structure, on average, caregivers report that they are raising 2 individuals, so children or dependent adults. And this ranges from families of 1 child or independent adult to 11 children or dependent adults. And I want to be clear that this does not include kids and adults with FASD. So about half of the children and adults that caregivers are reporting that they care for have FASD, either diagnosed or possible. But this would also include things like if you are, say, midlife and you're raising a couple of kids and you're also supporting your aging parent, or if you have another family member living with you, that would include that in that total. Almost all of the people who responded to our survey are primary caregivers, meaning that they are the person who takes the main role of being the caregiver in their home. And almost half, so 41% of caregivers are caregiving on their own. So they don't have other supports or other caregiver figures in their life to support them in the role of raising their families. Most of the children and people with FASD who are reflected in the study are school aged. So most of the caregivers report that I think it's like 60% of caregivers report raising kids who are between 6 and 17. And then there's a smaller proportion who have smaller kids and then older adults. On average, the kids that caregivers share their experiences on are 17. That's the average age, but they range, this dependents range from 6 months to 85 years old. So it's a huge range of different stages of life. Again, the majority of participants who have responded to the survey they identify as adoptive parents. A smaller proportion identify as biological parents or other biological family members, so grandparent or aunt or uncle or sibling. An even smaller proportion identify as foster parents and kinship caregiving situations. So this gives us an idea of the sort of family structure, and it also gives us a nice goal around what other caregiving relationships or caregiver roles do we want to be trying to recruit from, because it's of course wonderful to hear from the experiences of adoptive families, but we also really want to hear that whole range of experience, and so that we're able to compare what it might be like for somebody who's raising a child in an adoptive family versus somebody in a kinship care situation, for example.
Thank you so much, Katie. This is a really, it's so fascinating, the spectrum of caregivers' experiences as well. And some of the results of the findings have shown that caregivers believe in themselves and their skills and the potentials of their family. And so in these sections, the study asked to scale the ratings and said, for sentences like, I've had great success caring for my individuals with FASD. My caregiving skills and strategies have improved over the years. I am confident in my ability to care for my family. I'm proud of the way I care for individuals with FASD. I'm a strong advocate for my family. I feel motivated to keep going in my role as a caregiver. Being a caregiver has been a rewarding and fulfilling experience. And so based on those scaled answers, these are the positive reportings. And so you can see that 86% of people feel like they're strong advocates for my family and identify with those. So definitely things to build on and strengths that have been identified within caregivers. And here's another great quote from a caregiver in the study. I am grounded in my resilience as a caregiver and the successes the boys and I have had already. They are doing so well. And although it has taken so much work, looking back now, I know I can feel success in that. And so looking at these amazing quotes that caregivers have given and sharing their strengths is really a wonderful thing to learn about. And so as the study goes, and as a caregiver, it can be hard to find time to take care of yourselves. And some of the most common barriers to self-care for caregivers is a lack of time and energy, according to the studies. And here's a list of some self-care that are quick and free and can be used as often as you need throughout the day. So, have a look. You can breathe deeply, inhale, exhale, hold your breath between the inhale and the exhale. Get outside, sit in the sun, take a time out for yourself and lay down. Listen to your favorite song, pet an animal, walk around the block, stretch, watch a video that makes you laugh, hug someone, drink a glass of water, take a 5-minute shower, notice the way the water feels, and go to bed early. So these are just some ideas of activities you can do and give yourself permission to do. And these are the main areas that this survey, in all its length, where caregivers can share their perspectives on their children and adults with FASD. The topic areas were loosely based on the Towards Healthy Outcomes model that was discussed by Dorothy early on in this presentation. The data so far has not yet been analyzed in great detail for each of these issues, but we're still recruiting. And so make sure you click the QR code, and then we'll be using it to compile the information based on these identified areas.
Thanks, Melissa. So some of the things that we've found, we're going to take a look at some preliminary trends in caregiver well-being and coping. So this slide might be a little bit confusing, but you think if we get them to rate it on a scale from 0 to 5, with 0 being a stressor and 5 being a strength. So that basically that means anything under 2.5 is more of a stressor than it is a strength. Sort of between 2 and 3 is pretty neutral. So if you look at that, the relationship with the partner, most of the respondents said that that was a strength, that was important to them in terms of maintaining their well-being. And the relationship with relatives was a strength too. But as you can see, it's not quite as strong. Physical health, well, that was kind of neutral. A number of people said that, being physically healthy was a real strength. Other people said that their health has been affected by their experience in raising kids with FASD. I think it's interesting when we look at some of the other things like that sense of belonging, the emotional health, social support, stress levels. Those are being seen more on the neutral or stressor side than they are on the strength side, particularly the stress levels. People are reporting that there is a high level of stress that's associated with raising kids with FASD. Not surprising. It's very consistent with the literature Katie talked about at the very beginning. But I think that's part of what we wanted to do, is get more of a sense of balance, like what is helpful. And I think this kind of data really helps to help us understand that it's relationships that are really important. We do know that people are saying that there are great gaps in support. And I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anybody that's signed up for this webinar. Caregivers are just not getting the kinds of support they need. And that's part of what's contributing to that high stress levels and the emotional toll that this is taking. Because when you're only relying on your family or internal supports, in a lot of cases, those just aren't sufficient. But we do know that they are important. They matter. Connection matters. The strength in the relationship and those close connections. I know from my own experience that being involved in a support group, for example, was one of the things that helped get us through the tough times. Also, we adopted 2 boys. They had 2 biological sisters that were adopted separately. We developed a very, very close relationship with the family that adopted the girls so that we could keep the kids together. But it was that connection, that common experience that we could share that helped us understand that, okay, we're not the only ones going crazy. That sometimes when our family was in a state of chaos, I could actually talk to somebody else that got it, that understood, that had some suggestions, or that could just give me one of those really big hugs that I needed. So I think it's really, in my experience, it was that connection with other people that understood our experience that was really the most important thing. An example of this is a quote that we had in the survey. My husband and I are on the same page regarding our son. This is super important since no one else really understands the situation. My husband and I have a good relationship with our son, and that gives me hope for his future. So I want to switch now to talk a little bit about one of the hopes and needs that people completing the survey have identified. And we asked specifically, what would you need to make the future as successful as possible? There were, it kind of broke down into 4 main areas that people identified as being important: improved support system, caregiver respect, social connection, and socio-cultural change. I want to talk a little briefly about each of those. So in terms of improved support system, this is one of the quotes again from the study. Case management throughout a person's life, consistency with workers for years to build the relationships, transition supports, teens to adults, elementary to high school, preschool to K. Some of the identified improved support areas were in terms of accommodations, adult services, better access to local services, a collaborative community and care, creative and flexible fetal alcohol spectrum informed service providers, advocates, interagency communication, more training, having navigators, consistent transition supports, trauma-informed understanding about the whole family, wraparound services, those kinds of things. And I know in my own experience, again, when my youngest son was entered into school, his kindergarten teacher recognized his need for consistency. And so she switched grades as he did. So she was able to stay with him for the first 3 years. And that was really, really important to be able to help him manage those transitions. Unfortunately, she couldn't stay with him forever. It would have been really nice, but it was really important for us to have that consistency through that. One of the things that we've also found, and this won't be a surprise, there's a huge lack in transitional services, and people with FASD do tend to have difficulty with transitions. And so some of the difficulty is being able to keep some consistency throughout their lives. The other thing that they talked about were really very practical kinds of support systems, such as financial, things like insurance coverage, employment, housing, mental health, safety, stability, transportation, life skills, those kinds of things. So very, very practical things that could make life difficult. And I know, Katie, I'm sorry, I kind of jump around. So Katie has a hard time figuring out what I'm actually talking about. But anyway, one of the other areas was caregiver respect. And I know that I've experienced that in my past, in that it seems like people will listen to anybody but me. I found that often advocating for my child, it was important to bring their psychologists, our psychologists, their, special ed teacher into meetings, because I'm just a caregiver. What do I know about FASD? So one of the things that came out really strongly was that doctors and therapists need to take caregivers seriously and their concerns seriously. We need them to understand. We need them to listen. We need things like rest and respite. So again, that's a matter of respect, saying that we need to provide caregivers the time they need to be able to take care of themselves. There are very practical things. As Melissa said, one of the real barriers to self-care is time. So providing the ability for people to have rest and respite. Caregiver education is really important, and recognizing that actually caregivers are experts, and we often don't think about that, but they are the experts in their children. They know their children far better than anybody else. They have to be an important part of the team in developing future planning, and systems need to acknowledge that. Because we need to really seriously address the potential for caregiver burnout, because that is a problem. The next area was social connection. And one of the quotes here is, "My daughter's successful future is dependent on her having at least one caring FASD-informed and trauma-informed caregiver partner friend." That's I found to be really important as well, to have somebody that my sons could go to. they didn't necessarily want to go, especially in the teenage years. They didn't want to come to us. They wanted to go to, they needed to have a safe place to go to. And so that's where that social support network, not only for the caregivers, but for individuals with FASD is really important. And the caregivers talked about the need for mentorships, for teams. They needed to be able to trust that. I know it's a cliche that it takes a village to raise a child, but it's really true. They needed to find that trusting village that could provide a safety net for their kids when they couldn't, because we all need to face the potential that at some point we cannot be the safety net for our children, and we need others that are able to help us provide that safety and security that our kids so desperately need. In terms of sociocultural change, there was an importance, a need for societal awareness. Many people are feeling fairly marginalized. There needs to be a better understanding about the cultural considerations. The experience is not the same for people that are, for example, adopted within outside of their culture. There needs to be governmental change, really, in terms of FASD. There needs to be FASD informed policy, and we've been advocating for many years for a national framework for FASD. And my goodness, we were so close last year. We were so close. We were at the point where the bill was getting reviewed by the Senate, and that the expert committees the experts were being invited to come and speak to the bill when the government was prorogued, and now we have to start again. But I think it's really important for us to advocate for that national framework, because there does need to be that sociocultural change. All systems and levels of government need to connect, communicate, and collaborate. We need to challenge the media and the systems that promote a drinking culture. And one of the things that Kelly Harding has done some work on that drinking culture, and the fact that that young women are really have been a target of the alcohol industry in terms of increasing profitability, and there's real risks associated with that. So we need to have more of a global understanding of the impact of a drinking culture that quite honestly focuses on young women who are in childbearing years.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
those are some
Great.
of the things that we've looked at so far. Sorry, Melissa.
It's all good. Those are some great points. And I think as we go forward with this work, I want you to think about, as caregivers who are in our audience, if you could offer one piece of advice to a new caregiver or someone with FASD, what would that be? And again, as part of this study, they have been compiled into a book called Words of Wisdom, and there are 10 different categories. I won't read them to you, but the way the quotes can be organized. And we're going to have this book available. It's going to be a living document at the CanFASD conference for people to add their doodles, their words, their art, and just make this such a beautiful living document. And so we're going to do one more breathing exercise. And this one I use in my house with my kiddos all the time because it kind of forces mindfulness and prevents the monkey brain. So again, I want you to sit in your chair, sit upright with your feet on the ground. I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to just breathe normally in and out through your nose for 5 breaths. And as you're breathing, I want you to think about which side of your nose you're breathing out of. Some of us are more left dominant, some of us are more right dominant. Okay, once you've done your 5 breaths, I want you to keep your eyes closed and try to breathe out the other side of your nose. And so for me, this is a great way to be mindful about our breathing and allows us to kind of take a break from those thoughts and feelings that overwhelm us. And in my house, we call it the freaking out breathing. And it calms me down just as much as it calms my kiddos down. And there's some science behind it, so it's super fun. Our bodies naturally alternate between the nostrils about every 1 to 4 hours. And so we don't understand this in Western medicine, but in Ayurvedic medicine, they suggest that breathing through different nostrils stimulates the different cortex of your brain. And so when you're breathing through the left nostril, you're stimulating your right brain. And so it's the rest and relaxation side of your body. And when you're breathing through your right nostril, it links to the left side of your brain, and it's more the fight or flight response. And so if I'm in a super heightened state of mind, I might be breathing more through my left side. I might be more in that flight or flight. And so taking a moment to calm myself and try to breathe through the other side is really helpful. And either way, while your nose is working, your mind and body are connecting. So it's a really nice little activity.
When she first mentioned that, I thought she was crazy. I just breathed out of both sides. But when I started to do it and tried it, then I realized it really works. So it's kind of amazing. Thanks, Melissa. So
You're
one of the
welcome.
things that we asked is in the survey is, what have we missed? Because the survey is comprehensive, but it's not all that comprehensive. It could be more. So we wanted to develop an update of the survey. And so we asked, what are some of the challenges, successes, or experience that are important to you that were not covered in the survey? And some of the things that we found were that there were areas like addressing problematic system gaps, programs not having adequate policies, staff, funding options, and resources to actually help. Integrating FASD informed supports. The greatest challenge is getting people to understand FASD. Considering the complexity of family connections, it's been both rewarding and challenging to embrace them as a family and to find ways to move forward together. Understanding FASD across the lifespan, there continues to be maturing traits happening even as an adult in his 30s. The brain is a wonderful elastic organ. And promoting caregiver well-being. Challenges are day-to-day, keeping an eye on my own energy level so that I have the strength to travel a wave. So interpersonal and social factors such as trauma, isolation, and stigma can hinder caregiver well-being, and there needs to be more work done on promoting hope and resilience, and that's our goal. So the next steps are...
You must unmute to share the next step, hey?
Yeah.
The next steps, Dorothy's alluded to it a couple times, but we, as part of when we envisioned or designed this study, we thought it would be really neat to be able to follow up with caregivers who shared their stories in the beginning. So it's been, it was fall of 21 when we launched the survey. So now it's been yeah, I'm good at math, 4 years. And so we thought, okay, every 3 years, it would be so cool if we could follow up with caregivers and see where they're at, what's going on, what's changed, what's improved, what might be harder. And so we wanted to develop a 2.0 version of the study, which had some of those longitudinal points of what's changed over the last 3 to 4 years. And we also wanted to open up the avenue to ask questions around some of the emerging priorities that we have identified. So exactly what Dorothy was just explaining, these questions that caregivers have that we missed in the first iteration of the survey. What can we learn about these? And this is where we truly want to hear from caregivers about what they want to know more about. And so that we've woven in not only some of these longitudinal items, but also the emerging priority areas that we're hearing from caregivers. We also wanted to integrate different resources and self-care activities, just like the first version of the survey where we include those self-care breaks or different resources to research or kind of support documents and resources. We wanted to be able to update that and include things that have been developed over the last few years. So some of the areas, as Dorothy mentioned, that are priority areas for us to look at in this next version of our survey are those service and systems barriers. So, like, for example, navigating the legal system, or navigating the mental health system, or what sorts of barriers do folks encounter when they're trying to get an assessment. So kind of those higher level barriers that caregivers are really struggling with. And so we want to know more about what we can do to address or overcome some of those barriers. One topic that comes up a lot is what happens in later life. So what does FASD look like among not only adults who have FASD, but what happens when caregivers retire, when one caregiver passes away? What happens when there's that transition where, excuse me, across a life stage where we don't really know much about in those later life stages for both people with FASD and their caregivers. Another topic that came up a lot was stigma and how stigma impacts caregivers and families, and also balancing that out of what sorts of things can improve or bolster caregiver and family resilience. So looking at both of those kind of ends. And then there were a couple of special topics that caregivers identified as being some things they were curious about. Like we were noticing a lot of questions around sensory processing issues, experiences of people with FASD in sports and recreational activities. So how do sports and rec kind of improve lives, or what sort of unique barriers or benefits might come from engaging in sports and rec? And another area is a special topic that we're focusing on is identity development. So different cultural identity or disability identity. So we're asking specific questions around these special topics that caregivers have noted are important for them. So we are still recruiting, as we have said a couple of times. We want more voices. We want to hear more stories. So if you haven't already participated in the survey, please do. Here's the QR code. We are now recruiting for both 1.0 and 2.0, but you can only do 2.0 if you've done 1.0. So please do 1.0. We have published a couple of papers, actually, sorry, just one paper, but we are working on a number of papers so that we can start sharing these findings in the academic literature, and then also giving presentations to different conferences and meetings and organizations so that we can share what we're learning. And then finally, as we've mentioned a couple of times, this Words of Wisdom resource that I'm so excited about. We're developing it, and we're going to print off a copy of it to have at the conference. And ultimately, eventually, it will be a resource that we have on our CanFASD website, so anybody can access it and learn from these gems of wisdom that caregivers are sharing with us. So to sum everything up, I'll pass it back to Dorothy and Melissa.
So our takeaway is basically some of the messages that we get from the survey and that we want to pass on is that no two stories are the same. Everybody has a unique experience in terms of FASD. And it's important to recognize that just because you've heard one story, you still need to listen. You still need to assume that you haven't heard another story, because they are going to be different.
And we also need, oh yeah, go ahead, Dorothy.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. My fault.
Supportive environments are important for the whole family. The whole family needs support and services, not just caregivers, but the individuals with FASD, siblings, everybody that's involved. And then there needs to be the support so the family can work together. Okay, Melissa, go ahead.
Apologies, I got so excited. So we need stronger policies and funding. We need knowledge and training for healthcare professionals and beyond. And we need to leverage existing supports and strengths and learn from those and make things better. So thank you all.
One of the things.
Oh, go ahead, Dorothy.
One of the things that we always want to do with the work that we do with CanFASD is to talk about the what, the so what, and the now what. So what is the issue? So why is that important? And what are we going to do about it now? So I think that's really important as a service provider to think about, okay, you hear the story, you identify what it is, but you need to be able to help the people put plans into action. Okay, I'll get off my bandwagon right now. So again, thank you very much. And at this point, we'll just open it up. Katie unfortunately has a family emergency and needs to leave. So Melissa and I will do our best to answer any questions that you might have. And I'll pass it over to Halima, who's going to moderate this part of the session.
Here we are. So yeah, someone asked regarding the QR code to sign up. So I did already put the link in the chat, so you can go on there and visit the survey. Someone over here also asked if they could get a copy of the Lived Experiences book.
So the words of wisdom we're going to make it into a living document at the CanFASD conference in October. And then once it's embellished with doodles and extra quotes and made into this beautiful thing, it will be probably shared on the CanFASD website. So stay tuned.
Perfect.
Really excited about being able to provide it broadly, because that was part of the goal in the survey, is really to share the wisdom that caregivers have learned over time.
Thank you both. Next question is over here. What is the bill regarding the FASD informed policy, as I wish to read and understand more on it?
Great. The bill is S253. If you Google it, you can find more information on CanFASD's website. It made it to almost the third reading in the House. So it was very close to becoming
In the Senate.
in the Senate. So it was very close to becoming a bill, but hopefully it will be reintroduced with this current government and then move on. So hopefully that helps. Just Google FASD bill 253 and you'll find it.
Yeah, and it is on the Senate website. So, and basically it developed a framework that would be consistent across Canada in terms of areas like assessment and diagnosis and screening and service provision. It wouldn't necessarily require the governments to provide certain services, although it provides a framework for that, and did have a mechanism in it to follow up, to have the provincial governments, because of course most of it, health and social services, is also all provincial and territorial. It's not federal. And so there was a mechanism within the bill to have the provinces and territory to report back to the Senate or the House to respond to what their activities have been. So the goal was really to provide more consistency across Canada in assessment, diagnosis, and service provision.
Right then, next question. I think this is great, but how do caregivers find support? I am in the Peace Country in Alberta. There are no support groups. The FASD board do not want caregiver input.
That's a problem that we've heard over and over again, particularly in rural and remote areas. One of the things that I might suggest is to take a look at the virtual world. There may be options in virtual support. For sure, reaching out to other caregivers. In my experience, you have to be careful. There are some Facebook groups, for example, that I've been involved in that are, I don't know, frankly, they're very negative. They don't instill a sense of hope. People talking about the problems. There's not, some people providing information that, or solutions that are not good practices. So I think you have to be fairly careful. But what I would do is take a look at and search for some virtual support focusing in the area of neurodiversity, and potentially some of the information for autism, for example, may be very effective for people with FASD that have some of the same sensory difficulties and sensory challenges that people with autism have. So I think you just have to be creative in looking at what you can find out in the virtual world if you can't. And the other thing that I found is that my husband and I couldn't find any support groups for people with FASD, so we got involved with a couple other families and we started one. And it started on a shoestring, There was no funding for it, but ended up becoming the Saskatchewan Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Network, which is very effective now in providing education and training. And so even if there's not something within your local area, possibly look outside your area and see if there are other support groups. There may be support groups, virtual support groups, for example, that a Saskatchewan network provides. So take a look.
And I'll
And
echo, yeah.
another part of that is starting to train people, educate people in your community. And I know that's putting a lot of the responsibility on people that are already overwhelmed. But it's caregivers and caregivers advocacy that's going to make a difference in the long run. Sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
No, I'll echo everything Dorothy said. And for me, I didn't find the right fit with the caregiver support that I needed when I needed it. But I have a beautiful collection of moms that we've been friends with now for 18 years. Some of them have 5 kids who are affected. Some have 1 kid who's affected, and we have come up as a group with ideas to help and support our families, and just having them hear our experiences and like being able to share that freely that you don't often share with a neurotypical group of fun things and bad words and all sorts of stuff that happens. But having those honest conversations and creating your own caregiver support has been kind of instrumental in my survival. So maybe
Mhm.
consider, reaching out to like-minded parents in like situations.
Did you note and or notice differences depending on the age of the caregiver and their stage of caregiving? For instance, did caregivers of young children or teens seem more stressed? Did caregivers of adults with FASD seem more confident?
That's a really good question. I think it's really interesting, and it's disappointing that Katie had to leave because she's our data person. But in the conversations that we've had, I think one of the reasons that we wanted to do the 2.0 was to be able to look at things longitudinally. Right now, we're kind of at a snapshot. We just took a snapshot of people at a certain time, but we'd really like to be able to follow up with them to get more information about how it changes over time. I think generally it kind of seems, and this is really a kind of seems, it's different at different stages. But most of the caregivers that responded to the survey had school-aged children, somewhere in that range. So we don't have as many people that have older kids, for example, and are supporting adults with FASD. So it's kind of hard to answer that question now. We're hoping to be able to answer it much better in the future, but confidence appears to build over time and experience. That's not surprising. Challenges in terms of transition are pretty significant issues for people that have kids that are reaching that, the elementary school into high school into the real world, those kinds of things. Those areas, those times tend to be pretty high and create a lot of stress. Caregivers talk about a lot of stress and difficulty in those times. So it does vary throughout the lifespan, for sure. It's not a consistent experience. I don't know if that really answers the question. Melissa, you got anything to add?
No, a ditto, really. I think Katie's the holder of that data, but the more input we can have, the better and more reliable our data would be for those age ranges. And I mean, I can relate to everything Dorothy says as a parent. My ability to advocate has definitely changed over their lifespan. My understanding of FASD has changed over lifespan. My ability to like come outside the box with solutions has like evolved as I've been parenting. And so I think there's no one point where I'm like, oh, I was better here. I think it's always a continual evolution. I kind of find it a bit like a hurricane. Sometimes I feel better and sometimes I feel worse and I rotate back and forth. But it's a journey and I celebrate my kids every day and the joy and the fun.
Thank you both so much. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So I'd like to thank our speakers for this wonderful presentation today and for participants for listening from across the province. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Take care and stay tuned for more webinars by Health Nexus.
Thank you very much for joining.